We can say quite effectively that when Jesus comes and the rise of the early church happens at a unique point in the history of both Europe and that Near and Middle East. It's a unique point in history because this point in history is only going to last for a couple of 100 years before the whole of Europe is going to be rewritten again by virtue of this thing called the barbarian invasions. And so we have a window of opportunity for about 400 years. And that window of opportunity is the window that Christianity comes into. In many ways, if it wasn't for that 400 years, Christianity wouldn't have had the same access that it had. It wouldn't have had the same situation or the same realities moving its particular agenda. That Christianity and the things that Christianity were particularly offering to that society would have been very different. And by virtue of that, we see that there is a timing involved in the coming of Christianity. It was the appropriate, it was the right time for Christianity to come into the scene. So what were some of those things that added to the right time? Well, when we finished off with the intertestamental period, we finished in about 63 BCE with the beginning of the Roman occupation, or at least the Roman connection or power structure overlooking or overworking in terms of the Holy Land. And so the Romans took over that area under people like Pompey and later on in Julius Caesar and so on. It was also then given to Herod the Great to become the king of that particular piece of land. Even though he really was a vassal king, he was under the Roman authority. The Romans continued to expand their land, expand their empire, whereby their empire extended through into England, up to Hadrian's Wall. It extended through the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain, Portugal, and then into northern Africa. And so the whole of North Africa, all the way through to Egypt, and then into the Middle East. And over the Middle East, took over a lot of that area as well, and then into Asia Minor, and then also into today what we would call Greece and the Balkans. That area was all part of the Roman Empire. And so what we're living is an environment of occupation. These are tribes who had looked after their own affairs, who had their own religions, who had their own customs, had their own traditions, and now we're in a form of occupation. And it's that occupation that we need to see undergirds most of the writing of the Newer Testament. It also changes our perspective of the things that both Paul and Jesus were saying. Because in the midst of what both of them were talking about was in the midst of an occupation. They weren't controlling their own affairs. They didn't have a benign government who was offering them and giving them what they wanted. In fact, what they had was a government that was taking taxes in order to live the high life of Rome. The people would be taxed severely, both in order to pay for the local infrastructure and then the money flowing into the coffers in this faraway empire in Rome. You can imagine that the discontent was seething throughout the Roman Empire, and particularly in the Holy Land, where they had great memories of the Maccabees. They had memories of the time when they had been able to run their own affairs, when they had self-rule. And so that concept of having a discontent is part of the Newer Testament. We see, for example, that one of the disciples that Jesus chooses is a zealot. Now, the zealots essentially are the political terrorists of their time. These are the ones who are the guerrilla tactic people. They go out and they kill the occasional Jew, they kill the occasional Roman, and they're seeking to go into revolt. And of course, that process of gathering steam of a revolt, of coming up against the oppressor, reaches its height in 65 CE, when in 65 ACE they do revolt against the Romans. And for the next 5 years are fighting with the Romans in rebellion. A rebellion which is destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. And that destruction in 70 AD destroys not only the Jewish state, but it also destroys the city of Jerusalem. The city walls, the temple is destroyed. So occupation is such an important part of understanding the New Testament, because throughout the writing of the New Testament is in the midst of either the occupation which they have and then post the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. You must really begin to understand that most probably at least Matthew and Luke and John are written post that destruction. And if it's written post that destruction, you can see that what they're writing needs to be read in the light of that destruction, in the light of that occupation. When Paul writes to the church in Rome and says to them that they need to pray for those who are put into leadership above them, we need to realize that there's a context for that. In 65 CE, we have the Emperor Nero. And the Emperor Nero decides that he wants to use some real estate, or at least this is what some people believe now, that he wanted some real estate in Rome. And in order to clear the ground for that real estate, he causes a fire. And then, as any good person would do, he deflects the blame onto this new cult, this group of Christians. And so the Christians are mercilessly attacked and persecuted within Rome. Now, this is in 65 AD. This is only 30 years after Christ's resurrection. And yet at this point we see that when Paul writes to Rome, he tells them that they need to pray for those in authority, that God put them there. How difficult would that have been for the people of the Christians of Rome to think that God could possibly have put Nero into that position? And yet all the way through the New Testament comes the underlying theme in which we need to deal with occupation differently to what we would normally do. That in fact we need to see that there is a kingdom beyond the kingdom controlled by the pagans of this world. But there's the kingdom which is the kingdom of God, and that kingdom is here as well. And we need to connect with that kingdom. Out of that concept of occupation too, we need to draw the understanding of what's called the Diaspora. You need to see that in fact the Jews had spread out across the whole Roman world. The Roman world had Jews in every part of it. And as such, it created an opportunity and an access point for the New Testament to get into those areas. There were synagogues in all through Asia Minor. In fact, we know that because, of course, Paul himself was a diaspora Jew, a Jew of the dispersion, born in Tarsus in Asia Minor. We see that, in fact, when he went on his missionary journeys, it said that he always started in the synagogues. And so there were synagogues throughout the Roman world, whether in Asia Minor, whether in Greece, whether even in Italy itself. And so the diaspora is a way in which people would be everywhere throughout the different parts of the Roman Empire, there to be the leaven in the lump, so to speak, where they could have access into both Tanakh and then through Jesus Christ connecting into their communities. Of course, some of these communities often rejected Christ, rejected that Christ was the Messiah, but nonetheless, they were the access points for Christianity to begin to spread throughout the Roman world.